Hey, it's Alex once again from Remote Work Live. Thanks for joining me. And today I'm with Josh Little. And Josh is the founder and CEO of Volley. You can find Volley at www.volleyapp.com. And basically, Josh's experience is in sales and marketing at 3 Fortune 500 companies. And that's given him a really strong foundation in leadership, storytelling, collaboration, but above all, communication. And obviously, that's what we're all about when it comes to remote work. And his newest company, Volley, was built upon that foundation. Now, Volley helps teams communicate better and escape the problem of death by meetings. I'm sure we've all experienced that from time to time, but implementing asynchronous verbal communications and conversations, which fill the gap between text-based tools like Slack and video chat apps like Zoom. Josh's work has been highlighted in TechCrunch, in Mashable, in Entrepreneur, in Inc., and Forbes. And his accomplishments aren't only in the tech world. He also, believe it or not, is a classically trained singer and a fifth-generation pickler, which I've got to ask you about towards the end of the show, Josh, because that's just something that really sort of made me think. But Josh, thank you so much for joining the Remote Work Life podcast today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And yeah, let's go there because it's season. I think my hands even smell like dill and garlic right now.
I love my pickles, so we've got to ask about pickles at some point. So today we're going to talk about the power of asynchronous workplace communication, which is a hot topic. I mean, it's always been a hot topic in the world of remote work, but even more so now. And asynchronous verbal communication splits the difference between text-based and video-based chat. That's basically what Volley does. It brings remote teams closer, it increases efficiency, and it boosts company culture. Volley's asynchronous communication provides companies with a competitive advantage while also working to make remote team communication suck less. So, but before we go down the road of Volley, Josh, I just want to know more about you. I want to find out how you came to be where you are now. And I always wonder as well, when I'm on interviews like this, I always wonder if this was by plan or, by design or by complete accident. Did you see yourself in your current role, and tell us how you reached to where you are now?
Well, it wasn't by plan or by design. I didn't see myself in my current role until I was in my 30s. I didn't know I was an entrepreneur. There was no word for that in my hometown. My mom was an entrepreneur. She painted and cleaned houses. But the options available to me in my hometown were work at the prison, be a teacher, or work at the power company like my dad did. And I chose teacher, but that was kind of a winding path. I went from teacher to sales jobs in the corporate world to sales training and marketing roles. And it wasn't until I was about 30 that I realized that I wanted to build a company. I didn't even realize that was a path that was available to someone like me. So, I didn't see myself in my current role, but it was kind of going through the corporate world that I started to understand what problems existed and needed to be solved.
And what was that first coming up? You've been a founder, you're multiple founder, CEO of Maestro, e-learning, various different companies. What was that moment or that company where you realized that you are actually an entrepreneur, Or what was that point, should I say?
Yeah. So I was just trying to solve my own problem or scratch my own itch. I was building a global training program for Stryker, which was a medical device company, and trying to scale what we were doing. So I was trying to build e-learning. And this is, 2005, 2006, e-learning was kind of a new thing. And I was working with 3D animators and videographers and LMS providers and like 5 or 6 different vendors to pull together this thing. And it was like a full-time job. And I had a training program to run and, a team to manage. I couldn't take the time to do this. I thought there should just be a company that does this. And I looked around for that company. I couldn't find one. So I left and started Maestro. And turns out pretty much every other training manager in medical device or pharma felt the same way and wished a company existed like Maestro that you could just hand your content over to and they could run away and build beautiful e-learning courses and hand them back to you. So that's what I built, and that was kind of my first entrepreneurial venture, first of 4.
And has remote work always been part and parcel of your work culture? I mean, for me, I kind of was working remotely, but I didn't really think about it at the time. I was just doing it. It was just something that I did. Now, obviously, lots more people are talking about it, but was it for you something that just was part and parcel of what you did, or again, was that by design?
Actually, no. The last 3 companies, we've read books about remote work and results only and dreamed about working remotely and experimented with work from home Wednesdays and those sorts of things, but we could never get it to work because the tools didn't exist to help us get there. It was some version of worse communication working remotely, and so therefore we'd always get back to the proximity of the office because we could. And it's really, that's what Volley is all about. We're trying to solve that problem and help make remote team communication much better, higher fidelity, increase that connection, therefore increase productivity and help work flow and move faster. So it seems funny. It seems that somebody who builds a tool for remote team communication was probably a pioneer in remote work. And while I was really interested in the idea, I've never really been able to pull it off with my companies. And maybe that makes me even better suited to do what I'm doing.
And where things stand now, are you is Volley remote, or are you hybrid? How do you operate at the moment?
Well, it may sound dumb to anyone who's listening, but we didn't realize when we started Volley that we would, by necessity, have to be remote. We used to get together in a room, the 4 of us founders, and when we would sit in a room together all day, we wouldn't use Volley at all. And we were like, oh, I think we have to be remote just so that we can use our tool, because we've got to use our tool, right? So that wasn't immediately obvious to us, which it probably should be. But yeah, we're 100% remote and bringing on team members, wherever they exist. That we're trying to find talent regardless of geography or zip code.
And how are you finding the adaptation? Is it something that's because I know for some, I mean, I read a lot of the media. I mean, you can't escape it, I guess. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn quite a lot, so you see lots of people posting certain things about remote work, where it seems like it's quite 2 different camps, which probably is not real, but you've got those who sort of, it's really painful by the sounds of what the media is saying, and those that sort of like it's heaven. So I'm sure there's sort of areas in between that, but for you, how has the transition gone for you to remote?
Well, for us, it's been great because we have Volley. I can't imagine working remotely without Volley. In fact, I tried and it didn't work. And so Volley, I think, is the game changer for us. It's what will break this dam that has been, all of this demand that has been pent up. And we've kind of wanted to go remote for many years. COVID forced us there. But still, teams are trying to figure it out. Even though the workplace is evolving, we're moving to hybrid, companies are reducing office space. If you still only have the traditional communication stack, which means you're either doing one of 2 things. You're either typing to your coworkers on tools like Slack or email, or you're talking, and that means synchronicity. That means you have to get on a Zoom or get in a room, and those are really the only 2 options you have available for remote work. And that's why it didn't work for us, because when we type, we're doing something that we're naturally as humans 7 times slower at, composing written communication, and we're also squeezing all of the context of our message down into like 7% because only 7% of communication is the words which we speak. The rest is filled in with tone of voice and body language. It's why we're doing this interview on video, right? And therefore we need to talk to move work forward. We know that, we have that sense, especially when topics are more complex or deep. And so for that reason, that's when we switch over into synchronous mode and we, go back to back Zoom meetings. And so remote teams are either in some version of faceless communication like Slack or some version of interruptive communication like Zoom. Neither are optimal. That's why with Volley, we're trying to build kind of the best of both worlds, asynchronous video messaging tool that you can say what you need to say and move on with your day. Your coworkers can respond on their own time. It's the beauty of Slack with the richness of Zoom kind of pulled together in one, which is the thing that makes remote work not suck and allows work to just naturally flow. So that's what we and the thousands of teams that are using Volley now are experiencing is work that's just moving forward faster because we're constantly syncing up, checking in, unblocking. A lot of the things that we would have to put on the calendar don't really need to be. They're just 2 or 3 volleys. I needed to explain my idea. I needed to get your feedback. I needed to feel your energy about this. Like, are you really excited or not? And that's what we needed to move forward. And it doesn't have to happen Thursday at 3:30. It can happen right now or in the next 23 minutes or whatever it takes for us to move the conversation forward. So that's a little bit of what we're trying to enable.
And I love it because that my preference in terms of communication is, like I said before, I love video, I love audio. I'm not the fastest typer, and when I try to type quickly, it's not as accurate, and I can't necessarily always get across the kind of you mentioned about tone of voice, the actual kind of message I want to put across. So right in my ballpark. I love the idea of video and this instant message and I like the idea of asynchronicity as well. Although the team I work in right now, we're very much synchronous. We're looking at obviously different ways of working, and I think again it's another reason I wanted to speak to you today is because asynchronous work is just going to be part and parcel of the way more and more people work in the future. So love having you here. But what for you though, Josh? I mean, obviously every business, every career, I guess, has challenges along the way. What's been your biggest challenge, and how have you managed to overcome that to build the business that you have now and your career that you have now?
Yeah, well, I don't know. This could be a long podcast if we go deep, but I've had a lot of them, co-founder breakups and failures and whatnot. But one of the more recent ones, I was working for a couple of years trying to figure out what to do next. I've built 3 tech companies. I was really looking to build my magnum opus, and I worked on about 12 different ideas, and one of them I was cutting a car air freshener that I was trying to create, and I was doing this on my table saw, and the saw kicked back and shot the block into my left eye and just took out my left eye, and or basically obliterated it. And so, not to get too gruesome, but here I was working on my 11th idea, trying to make something happen, and and nothing had worked to this point. And I have a major physical setback, 3 months of surgeries and post-op, and yet we've got the eyeball back. It's not working, but it's an eyeball now, and some cosmetic surgery to make it look. I look sort of normal now, but I can only see out of one eye. So it was a huge setback, and it really helped me focus on what really mattered and what was I trying to do and what was the music in me that I needed to bring into this world. And it was really only through that setback or that situation that I was able to come to something like Volley and be still enough to wait for that time to come. And and so it's kind of where a setback has kind of led into what I consider my magnum opus. It's Volley. It's what my whole career in life has been building up to, is to create a communication tool to help work move forward faster. It's what I've been focused on the last 20 years of my career.
And that in itself, I mean, the story there is the focus in terms of that you must have had to overcome a challenge like that. a setback like that is just, I suppose, lots of people who probably didn't have the resolve that you do may have given up. But I think it's obviously then testament to what's inside you, I guess, and it's set you up to be the I guess the leader that you are now, and not just within your company. But I think it's something that I mean, I speak to lots of people who talk about different things that are interrupting their career, and you think to yourself, well, that's not so bad, and they probably don't really appreciate that things could be much worse. But I couldn't imagine that. But that to me is something to really inspire. It inspires me anyway. And in terms of leadership,
well, thank
though,
you.
Josh, no problem. I mean, in terms of leadership, there's people like yourself who've been multiple entrepreneurs, and again, even that, because I myself, I see myself as an entrepreneur as well, and I've had setbacks myself, and it's kind of really sort of knocked the stuffing out of me, which is why I was saying to you that, to overcome not just the entrepreneurial side of things, but what you were just talking about is something that really sort of motivates me, and I'm sure it's going to motivate a lot of other people out there. What's been your most, because I'm sure there are people probably that inspire you, you've got leaders as well maybe around you who you sort of look up to. What's been your most important leadership lesson that you've learned?
Well, probably learning how to play with all cards on the table. That's how my mom used to like to play cards, with all of the cards face up so that we could see each other's hands. She thought that was fun. I thought it was frustrating, but I use that as a metaphor for how I like to lead. If you work in the corporate world, there's a lot of secrecy. There's a lot of veiled communication. There's a lot of places you can't go, things you can't understand. And so my first company, when I left out as an entrepreneur, that was kind of my communication style. I did keep things closer to chest. I wasn't open and honest about the state of the company, where we really were, and what was hurting and what wasn't. And some of that is, responsibility. But I've learned that the more and more that you can bring your team into the reality of what's going on, the gravity of any situation, the better. They're adults; they can handle it. The more that you share, the more that you play with all the cards on the table, show them the financials, what's going on, what the stakes are, the more they're going to be committed to what you're doing, or turn green and leave, which is also good, right?
I tell you what, mums are always right, aren't they? There's mums that, no matter how much we argue with our mums, they're always right in the end.
That's right.
And that is the essence of remote work, isn't it? I think as well, in terms of what I found. Because I mean, I've been working remotely myself since 2009, but I've only really been actively in the community in the last couple of years. And I used to work in that kind of environment where it was very sort of closed and secretive, and we had an expression for it. We used to call top drawing. So basically, where people would hide things away in their top drawer so that nobody else could see what they were doing, and that kind of spilled down from the leaders all the way down to the people on the shop floor, basically. And I think that the essence of, and that's what I love about remote work, is the essence of it is that collaboration, is communication, is sharing information, is helping each other out with different sort of obstacles and hurdles. So I love that. I love that idea of having all your cards out on the table. But of course, we're here to talk more about the power of asynchronous workplace communication. And what I want to know, Josh, is, because I mean, again, I've worked remotely, but mostly I've worked in teams that have been synchronous myself. So this is a bit personal to me, because I want to find out myself about how you're enabling teams to work remotely and on an asynchronous basis. How can remote teams continue to develop relationships despite the distances, despite those so-called barriers, I guess, that lots of people are talking about?
Yeah, this is a hard problem. Buffer's State of Remote Work study last year cited the top two problems with remote work being lack of communication and loneliness. And Alex, before our call, when we were talking, you had mentioned this was a challenge that you had faced, is just like feeling disconnected, feeling isolated from the team. And while we've done this during the pandemic, I think the signs of wear and tear are starting to show, of like back-to-back Zooms and lack of connection. And it turns out that all of those little interactions that we didn't really appreciate, the around the water cooler, meeting up in the hall, going out to lunch together, talking in the parking lot, whatever those are, those little things that may or may not have been about work, they in isolation seemed like nothing, but when you take them away, they summed up to equal communication. They summed up to equal relationship in our culture. So when you're working remotely, those things do matter. And so one of the ways that you can continue to develop relationships is to communicate differently than you had, and to bring back some of those things that were the fun and the spontaneity that you had in the office. And that's part of what Volley enables. Is it enables you to talk without interrupting someone. It enables you to lean over without tapping someone on the shoulder. And that's the beauty of asynchronous. It's outside of place or time. Even, this synchronous call isn't really synchronous. We're still about a second apart. Therefore, we feel the awkwardness of gaps in the conversation. But even if you separate those by 10 or 20 seconds or 10 minutes, the conversation can be just as good. So in Volley, we take turns, just like any conversation, just like we've taken turns in this conversation, except we record our turn in video, which gives us kind of the best of both worlds, the richness of talking with the flexibility of texting. And so when I say talk different, I mean use a video messaging tool, something like Volley, that'll give you that richness of the interaction. You can tell the joke, but the other person doesn't have to listen to that exactly when it's coming out of your mouth. They can listen to that after they wrote the last line of the manifesto, after they finished those 3 or 4 lines of code that was like finishing the problem that they've been working on. So we hope Volley is going a long way into allowing talking, something that is valuable, something you have to do to move work forward, to not be interruptive, and to be able to be batched and pulled into, pockets of your day, and allow for deep work and more productivity in a remote work environment.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced those challenges myself, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm working in a team at the minute that, although we're remote, the culture isn't necessarily, that's not the foundation of the team. So all those things that you just mentioned there, in terms of the water cooler moments, those spontaneous things, you can sometimes feel that it's missing within that sort of scenario. And we're trying to build, because it doesn't come naturally. And I think if you've got something like the app that you mentioned, the Volley app, that can help, because it can just help you to, like you said, not just on the work side of things, but the banter as well, and the actual, doing things like you said on your schedule. So I really love that idea. One thing that I suppose we tend to do, not just us, but I mean, I've spoken about this on a previous podcast. There are people, I can give you plenty of anecdotes of people who are going from meeting to meeting and literally spending hours in meetings. And one of my colleagues, I was sitting next to him in a cafe. We decided to get together on a work day. He works for a different company, and I couldn't believe the number of meetings he had in the day. He had easily 3 to 4 hours of meetings per day, and not necessarily meetings that he thought were productive. Things that, he was complaining basically that he could have done things, things could have been done much more quickly just with a simple email or a simple sort of communication. So that's a problem that lots of people are facing right now, is sort of figuring out how to do meetings, or at least reduce the number of meetings that they have to avoid things like that Zoom fatigue or that video fatigue that you experience. How can leaders, from your perspective, Josh, reduce time spent in meetings, but still lead effectively? Because I think some of them feel as though the meeting is the way to lead, if you see what I mean.
Well, yeah, Patrick Lencioni actually said leaders lead in meetings. And while that may be true, what I think he's saying is that leaders lead in interactions with their team. It's not true that it is true that historically the only way to have an interaction with your team is like to just pop into their office or to have a meeting, interrupt them or have a meeting with them, right? Both of those are meetings, one scheduled, one is not. But the reality is that a leader isn't really leading when they're sitting alone in their office on their whiteboard or whatnot. So in order to reduce time in meetings, you have to still lead and communicate effectively. So like I said before, we have to talk in order to move work forward. Working remotely does not change that fact. You have to talk and collaborate to get on the same page as a team, get alignment, get buy-in, all of those things. But it's about talking differently in a way. We've all heard this meeting could have been an email. We've heard that adage. Well, maybe it couldn't have been an email because you did have to explain something. You did have to kind of like check in and get feedback, but it probably could have been like 2 or 3 volleys because you really just needed a moment to explain and needed, to just check in and see where that other person is. So the way to reduce time spent in meetings is to convert some of those to asynchronous. Now you can't convert those to asynchronous text because probably the reason you're in a room together is you needed to talk. You needed the full fidelity that this moneymaker of a face and voice can provide, right? But you can convert some of those to asynchronous video messages, and so that's one of the things we're seeing with Volley is teams that are constantly syncing up, checking in, unblocking. Many of these things probably would have been on the calendar, but when you have a tool like Volley, you can talk without interrupting. You can still kick off the idea, ask the question, make the interjection, and everyone can coalesce around that idea, sort of outside of time and place. So that's how they can still lead effectively. Is this idea we've kind of dubbed as continuous leadership, but that's only enabled with a tool like Volley, which helps you have these asynchronous video conversations outside of place or time.
Mm-hmm. And what suggestions do you have for a team? Again, there's lots of teams considering, shall we go hybrid? Shall we go back to the office? Shall we go fully remote? What would you suggest for a team that is considering going basically remote forever?
Well, async by default has to be the mode of communication for successfully going remote forever. The other option is endless back-to-back Zoom meetings. And that I don't think that's a forever solution. I think, we held our breath through COVID, most of us, and we got through it, but it's not a long-term solution. So asynchronous has to be the default mode of communication. But the unfortunate part of that is most asynchronous tools, the primary input mode is a text box. And, it turns out it's not just what you say, it's how you say it that matters. And so my suggestions for a team that's going remote forever, I would ask them to take a deep look at their communication, because communication equals culture. Your culture doesn't exist outside of your communication. So the way that you communicate as the team, the way that you show up, the way that you show empathy, check in, is going to be what your culture is long term. And if you want a healthy culture, you have to have healthy communication, healthy dialogue, and that doesn't necessarily come from back-to-back Zooms or slacking your face off all day. So this is why I said earlier in the interview, this is why I've not actually been able to work remotely until Volley, because the tools haven't existed to allow communication to flow like it does naturally when we're in proximity with one another. I can, see you across the table, ask you a question, you can check in, but the beauty of Volley is we're not interrupting the 4 people around us.
Love that. And while you were saying that, I was thinking to myself as well, I mean, not just that, like you said, async is just something that is going to be part and parcel of the future of work. It's going to be more talked about more and more. And hopefully we can have you back on the show at some point to see how you're getting on with Volley. And, you've got thousands of businesses already in the bag. But as I said before, people, you can go across to volleyapp.com. That's VOLLEY app.com, and check it out. What I would say, I was trying to think of a segue as well into the whole pickle question, but I just couldn't think of one. So I'm just going to ask it straight out. Tell me about your pickle business. I'm really sort of intrigued about that. I know I've only got a little bit of time, but what's that all about, Josh?
Well, I mentioned kind of this 2-year trying to explore different ideas and opportunities for my next thing. Pickles was one of them. My family didn't have money to hand down, but they did have really good pickle recipes, and they wrote them down in leather-bound notebook, starting from my great-great-grandfather, and passed them down. I used to make pickles with my dad when I lived in Michigan, but then when I moved to Utah, that was the first realization, is like, oh no, I don't have pickles. I got to make pickles. And so I started making them here and started giving them to friends. And then that ended up being friends of friends and friends of friends of friends. And it became, big enough that I couldn't afford to do it and just needed to charge. And then that turned into a little pickle business. And I've never built anything, any product, anything that people have reacted to so fanatically as these pickle recipes, specifically the dill, the classic dill recipe. Yeah. I mean, like people like shouting with glee, popping them in their mouth, running around, putting just like nothing. No one has reacted with any like Volley or anything with that level of excitement. So that's why I thought, man, maybe this should be my next thing. So I hired a pickle scientist, and we started working together and created a lab out in my garage and made hundreds of batches of pickles trying to make this commercially viable recipe. And it would work. It's like 100%er. Very few businesses, what I say, are like, it'll just 100% work. But the problem is, after you've built 3 software companies, it's really hard to look at the P&L of a pickle company and get excited, because it's a really capital-intensive, grindy, multi-decade long journey to profitability. Like it's not very fun when you look at, a software with just like infinitely scalable and all the multiples that exist in tech. So maybe I'm a little spoiled, but I just couldn't pull the trigger on a pickle company. So now it's just a total hipster hobby that I continue. I make pickles once a year. I sell out in about an hour. That's good enough for me and the fans that exist here locally in Utah.
That's incredible. I mean, the reason I ask is I love pickles. I genuinely love pickles. Like every time I go to the supermarket, I'm probably getting a jar of pickles per week that I have myself. So that was just my curiosity. But no, obviously we want you to keep us up to date on how you're getting on with the software stuff and the Volley in particular. So we'll be keeping an eye on Volley for the foreseeable future. Keeping in touch with you, Josh. Thank you for joining us today, and looking forward to hearing how Volley develops in the future.
I love it. So am I. I'm curious too.
Excellent.